It's SWOT is the acronym there. And my topic today is data-driven IV&V decision support. You can see the basic agenda there. I'm going to kind of set the boundaries of what decision support means, at least for my presentation, and then talk about data availability, which of course is common sense. You can't do anything with data if it's not available to you. There'll be several kind of categories or ways to look at it that I'm going to bring up during that period. And that'll be the bulk of the talk. Data presentation. Of course, you need a way to look at that data and do anything useful with it. Analysis, reporting, and metrics, and then some related efforts, some of which have been talked about during the week here at the workshop and other discussions we've had. So decision support, I mean, it's a straightforward thing on the one hand within any organization, but for what we're doing here as it defines it, it's really helping people make decisions that's supported by relevant data, and that last part's the key thing. Decision support inherently has a process component to it, and I'm not saying that isn't something that will be talked about or seen at all in my slide, but that's not really the focus of this. This is really the data side of it and the focus, and that word relevant, I probably should have highlighted that too. That's a key thing. Data isn't very useful to you unless it's in context and relevant to the purposes that you have at hand. So, and of course, a simplistic definition to set the stage. A decision is the choice of one among a number of alternatives that you are going to make as an individual. And decision making, this is where that inherent process comes in. Some, of course, making that choice. You're assessing the data that's available to you and identifying some possible alternatives that you're going to decide between relative to that data. So again, the concept of data availability, of course, if you don't have that, you certainly can't apply that into your decision support process. And what this slide here is really showing is, and these are terms I've sort of abstracted from my own view of the world. There's a lot of overloading out there when you read about data-related topics. So for our purposes, if you read that from left to right, it's really the most lightweight is what I would say, the on-demand data, then linked data, and then of course the most robust brings the most complexity and other things to it would be the data warehouse, but they all serve a purpose, and we'll talk about that. And I guess on-demand data, I would also, maybe that wasn't the best term I picked, but I would also say that's, for my purposes, synonymous with original source for the data or single source, not so much you're linking between things. That's the distinction I would make there. So it'll become a little clearer, hopefully, here with some other slides. And so again, on-demand data, and this is something almost any organization, I think, struggles with really maturing their use of data. I mean, the whole workshop this last several days, data's been everywhere within these presentations, and you know, how you use that data is a very difficult thing for people to determine. But even this, what I would call the pretty simplistic or straightforward use of it, this on-demand data view of the world, you know, we can, as IV&V, both analysts and leads and senior management, support our daily decision making with just that kind of access. And one thing, when I was preparing for this presentation, this wasn't intentional. I should probably kind of set the stage before I go into some of these little scenarios, some simplistic scenarios. Is I didn't intend, these are really driven, a lot of these sort of the little scenarios I have are talking about PMs and office lead and senior management. My intention is not to convey that data is not relevant to an analyst either in any of these situations. I probably would have done that a little different and had a few examples, and I may try to fit those in if I can think of that to fill the gap. But the point is, data is important to everybody, and there's something to be gained from that. So that wasn't my intention, even though those are the actors in these scenarios. So example one here of an on-demand data usage. You know, a IV&V project PM, they may say, based on the issues we've identified so far on our project, where should we focus our available IV&V resources? And resources are always something that can not be what you want them to be. So that's an important decision or question you should be asking yourself. And we have a tool we track here in the facility, our Orbit tool that tracks our IV&V identified issues. Something as simple as developing queries through that tool that are configured to show your current project IV&V issues by category and severity. We do have PMs who take advantage of that. This is sort of that most lightweight thing, but certainly it's a valid thing to do and something that leverages you in your decision making on a daily basis. So we just want to enforce that or reinforce that, I should say, as an organization, to use the things available to you, and SWOT can help you configure those tools and queries and things, and dashboards, et cetera, to help you with that. Example 2 there, a PM may say, I've got my team members, we've got an important upcoming milestone review for our development project we're supporting. Who should I allocate to that? We use the Atlassian Jira tool now quite a bit within the program to track tasking, and I know there's projects that have gone very deep into that. I think JWST has done so and really has some good process surrounding how they track their tasking. So if Pat Tiki as the PM or Don Oe as the civil servant lead on that project, they wanted to look at what their current IV&V project tasking status is by assignee. Jira has built-in concept of a dashboard. So you're going to that single source, original source. It's on-demand data. You can configure that dashboard and go to that, allow that to support your decision making. It's fairly simplistic, but again, it's a valid scenario for doing such. Example 3, IV&V office lead, Steve Roquet in our instance, he would maybe want to know which project risks currently require greater attention within, say, the IV&V office level. And we have a tool that we have been using within the program for a little while now called a Risk Manager. And there's process embedded in there, but ultimately for people to support that decision making and view of the world, you need a way to get that data and look at it in interesting ways. There is a 5x5 matrix view that's on the home screen or dashboard of that tool, and this is just an example of a screenshot here that's filtered by the different risks that are currently active within the IV&V office. So Steve at a glance, or whoever's interested in that, can just say, okay, these ones that fall within this area, and you, of course, within the tool itself, you can click within one of those cells and drill down into that data deeper and see, okay, these 3 risks that sit out here in the red 21 as far as the magnitude, I'd like to investigate those further. So again, just another example of how just going direct to the data source and using things that are available to you can support your decision making. Then kind of taking that again from left to right, now you're getting into the linked data, and this is really where things get interesting. And I know there's been talks this week about, I think James Trawick did a semantic data presentation, and Bill Stanton did some data mining, and of course the AMF discussions about analysis-based data with artifacts and assessments. This is where it gets interesting when you can start making relationships and links between data. And again, kind of to define that for the discussion here, it's structured data, and maybe I should have bolded that word too, that there are, of course, some instances of unstructured data that we all deal with, documents on ECM and things, and not that those don't have any relevance or importance, but for purposes of what I'm conveying here, this is structured data, not just a document that you're linking to without some relationship defined between attributes or fields between those sources. So, and an important thing there is it's linking between multiple sources, multiple data sources that's been related in some way to make other useful knowledge available. So again, back to the decision support, you're trying to get data from multiple sources and learn or have relationships defined that are giving you some insight that helps you make decisions that are valuable. This diagram there is very simplistic, but the left side, of course, you've got the different data sources, whatever those happen to be, and then some linking of that data, which can be in different forms. But And then, of course, you've got ad hoc reporting capabilities and dashboard views and other tools or applications that can take advantage of that linked data. So if we're referring to linked data, I almost didn't use that term. I don't know, for those who digged very deep into some of that term may be familiar. You'll hear that thrown around with people call it the semantic web, which is a web-based view of the world where you have these unique data entities that you can have these relationships defined, and they all live out on a URL, and there's a unique way to access those and query them in essence for attributes about them. That's not, I kind of wanted to abstract that up a level above that, because that's not the only instance or the only view of that you can take. I think linked data, a relational database, that's inherently why that's powerful. You're relating things together to have valid meaning between things. So, but as it says there, each data entity, no matter what stance you're taking, there has to be an individual identity to be able to access that. For example, it could be a URL, like I just mentioned, if you're talking a web-based situation, but relational database, you've got primary keys and unique identifiers and things. So, and as I just said, the real advantage or power comes leveraging that relation between the data. Of course, the content of that data itself means something to you, or you wouldn't be capturing it or wanting to look at it, but that's not what's really going to give you the power when you get into the linked data. It's defining and understanding those relationships between things. So, these concepts versus, you'll hear people say these silos of data or separate silos, and a lot of the time those can live in spreadsheets. And I think every organization, frankly, has those things that still, and then they have their purpose. I'll actually mention that here in a little bit too. But if there's important things you want to learn about your data, you need to think about how you can relate things and take advantage of those kinds of technologies, and not just leave things sitting off in pockets, of course. And the advantages you get from that, it remains in an appropriate context as it's referenced through a common interface, a web service, or a centralized data store. So, I mentioned this whole semantic web thing. That's just one example, but of course you can integrate data. That's another term you could use here when you're talking about this. Integrate data from different sources into what people would call, say, an operational data store, where you can still have those relationships defined and be learning things from that. Data's linked or related is the synonymous here, I guess, enabling information to be combined across our organization and even outside the organization. There's interesting things you can start to pull in that you might care about that have some relationship to the things we are looking at. And of course, that data is still accessible from other applications that want that for live data purposes. But you can take the static exports or dumps from the system at any time if you want to export that. So there's ways with the linked data concept to just leave things in place, access them through web services, but still have the ability to take advantage of looking at relationships. So, these are pretty fundamental things here, I guess, of vocabulary. And again, I would I guess reference back, since there's been multiple presentations about it, but the AMF domain model that they had been talking about, and they use the term ontology there. Again, you've got to define some sort of formal or shared vocabulary to document those relationships between things. That's just a foundational thing. And when you do that, and you start talking about not just the data in its single location, without talking about the semantic relationships between things and how you're going to start looking at this, you can start to even have inferences about that when you're looking at the data. And again, if you go out and you look at these things that have been done with the semantic web, there's some really somewhat out there academic views of the world of how the entire World Wide Web can be talking to each other with different data components that are linked together, and you can make inferences about things, and there's some validity to that. But even if you don't try to take it to that end state there, just these fundamentals, you can still gain value from looking at your data. And as it says there under the search, you can just kind of, I won't call it blindly, but just sort of take a walk down the path in terms of just traversing that data. And there's some value to that. But of course, we all know, you just, again, fundamental database, relational database, the real power is you need some sort of search, or as it says, query there capability. That's what's going to add value to you, not just kind of visually going through the different things and trying to surmise something useful from it. So. I guess I didn't realize these were animated quite like that. That's okay though. But this is an example of the IBV Office lead in terms of a linked data view of the world. They're asking what types of IV&V issues or risks have we been identifying with for missions with similar characteristics. And I know there's been a desire to, we've got a lot of heritage here within the program looking at different missions and doing analysis. A mission profile in terms of the type of systems we're looking at and all sorts of other attributes. That's the kind of question that you may want to look at, and that link or that relation would be by project or mission. It's really there'd be other things, but that just for this simplistic example, that's what would link or relate these things. And one way you could look at that type of view is a SQL Server report, let's say, that is generated based on data that's coming from those multiple data sources, which could be an IBM issue tracking system, risk manager tool like we talked about, a project mission database, and then, of course, this could be part of a centralized operational data store where you are, in essence, integrating data into a common place that has a link or relation to each other. Another example here could be, which of my team resources may be overloaded with active issue follow-up and additional tasking. So, when you look at that question there, it just seems like a straightforward thing a manager would ask. But of course, the data is being linked or related by analysts. If you have the data being captured in these different systems, we've got IV&V issues or orbit tracking system, and then also JIRA. There's task tracking. There's two different data sources, but that's a single view that they are going to use to support their decision making. So let's see. I had something else there. Guess not. Yeah. So again, the linked data concept, and I guess before I hit the last piece here on the data warehouse, I know there's been a lot of talk too in the program, pushing some systematic approach to evidence-based assurance. That of course ties directly into this too, the accumulation of data or evidence and being able to, see the relationships or make the relationships between things to support those kinds of activities. So that's of course part of this bigger picture, I guess you could say. And a data warehouse, this is the most robust. I mean, it was clear to the right of that continuum I'm talking about there. But the real power you get, of course, from this is the historical analysis and trending, because you're not talking just about a single snapshot of people would call it a transactional database that you're doing using a tool and it's updating records in there. You're talking about data that's coming from different data sources and being accumulated over time. So that's the distinction fundamentally of when people want to talk about a data warehouse. And that's where the robust and I bolded there strategic, this is where you start to be able to look at things in an entirely different way in terms of period over period kind of view of the world, or as of a certain date. And you can start to do strategic decision making or predictive things even by looking at your data. And the real key thing about that, and there's other dimensions is what they usually refer to them with data warehousing. Typical relational database and entity relationship diagram. People talk about database normalization. That ends up in having quite a few tables. A data warehouse, one of the most common ways you would structure it is they call it a star schema, and you have an individual table in the middle that's called a fact table that has very granular pieces of information that you've been capturing at those periods of time, and all of the kind of stars or fingers coming out of that fact table are the dimensions that you're looking at relative to that, and time is one of the main ones. And that's really where I think the true power comes if you're going to accumulate data and do the data warehousing, because it is that historical dimension to the data. And this diagram, it kind of overviews really everything I talked about a little bit, but if you were going to have a data warehouse view of the world, on that left-hand side there, the operational data, and these are tools we use within the facility and otherwise, but doors, requirements, management tool and traceability-based tool, orbit issue tracking that we talked about, even static analysis data. We run static analysis tools, that can be data that we care about in some way. File data, even though that's not structured, there could be something we could do with that in terms of creating some metadata about those files or whatever we decide we want to do with that. So, and then of course any other IV&V data. I mean, one thing before I kind of move to the right through that diagram, in the other IV&V data bucket, you'll hear people talk about big data too when they talk about data warehousing and things. And if you're going to start accumulating certain quantities of data, some places just off the top of my head, I think that could happen for the IV&V program. If like in our on-orbit anomaly area, for instance, if we started accumulating development project defect issue tracking database information, for instance, that could accumulate data rather quickly if you wanted to keep that over time in history. And so again, that's just one example. And of course, even static analysis data, if we were to decide that there's some things about results that we wanted to look at, and there can be thousands of results that come out of a static analysis run. So it's not difficult to imagine how you can get to that big data view of the world, even within IV&V, depending on what your desires are. So, this middle part here, the integrated operational data, that's really where you start to get that linking concept, that integration of data. And this ETL here, this is again a kind of a catchphrase people throw around, but extract, transform, and load. It's basically taking something from one data source, and if you need to manipulate it, or even fixing the data some if necessary before you put it into another place. So typically, you might have this data staging area where some of that happens. And then the IV&V ODS there, that's the operational data store, where potentially even other tools like a requirements analysis and traceability tool, which something like the analyst workbench or other tools that people have used, could certainly access data that's then been brought in from other places if they wanted to. And as you go to the right there, if you're going to get into reporting metrics and as it says, decision making, which is what this kind of whole framework of the presentation was, is supporting decision making. You bring in the data warehouse, and those DMs stand for data mart, and those are just little views of the world relative to the data in that data warehouse. So here's a couple of example questions. The TQ&E lead, our technical quality and excellence group, they may want to ask the question, is there any correlation between IV&V issue generation rates and the maturity of methods employed by the IV&V teams? I know that the catalog of methods and those kinds of questions have been talked about recently. Well, when you start asking those questions, you really do need that historical data to be captured so you can see over time, what kinds of things you can glean from those sorts of questions. So it's analyzed over a period of time, as it says there, the data is. And then, of course, again, a term you'll see thrown around, business intelligence or BI, is you configure those types of tools to aggregate or really integrate those facts, as I've mentioned earlier, to be able to do analysis of any relationship, really. So, and senior management, even, typically in large organizations, these kinds of warehousing initiatives or data, even senior management, of course, they have vested interest in asking things like, do projects with senior level analysts generate more issues or higher severity issues? That may be something useful for senior management to have some insight into also. Yeah, I spent most of the talk, as I figured I needed to, on the availability, because of course, as I said, if you don't have that data available to you, you can't do anything with it. But just because it's sitting out there in some database or someone's calling it this or that or a warehouse, that's pretty much useless to you unless it can be presented to you in some fashion. So as it says here, data must also be presented for the decision support. And that can happen in any number of ways. Dashboard views of data can be just in a simple table and chart format. And you know, we've seen some of that in the tools we use at the facility, and the Jira dashboards and things are really much like that. Including you can have, of course, custom interfaces that access those other data sources. So, you know, I mentioned on-demand data was my first or most lightweight view of the world. If you have a web service set up where you can have a tool like the Risk Manager tool we talked about a little bit that can be accessed through a web interface, then some other tool or application that wants to permit a view of that data within a dashboard, that certainly facilitates that without even getting into the linking of data concept. And SQL Server reports, you can deliver those through a web interface. And we within the program here are standing up some capability relative to SQL Server reporting services. You know, that's something, you know, we do have a SQL Server infrastructure in terms of the database backend, and that's something that Microsoft gives you that really is a business intelligence tool, you could say, that allows you to configure views of data and do reports, and analysts or project leads or managers can take a look at that data through these web reports. So, and of course, Excel does have a purpose, and I know people use it, and certainly should when it makes sense. And you know, you can populate Excel with outside data whenever, you know, there's certain analysis capabilities right within Excel that people are comfortable with, familiar with, that allows you to do, you know, summations and other, you know, interesting charts or whatever you want to get out of the data. And that's certainly a valid use case to put data from these data sources into Excel for that purpose. This last bullet here, visualize data, that's something people will throw around, but really, if you get into the true warehouse kind of concepts and business intelligence type dashboards, someone is going to probably be drilling down and using things like a visualization technique to help them expose patterns they're seeing in data and trends and correlations. You know, some of the things we talked about earlier, a couple of the examples would be some correlations there, but you know, that would just be one technique through a presentation or visualization aspect to be able to do so. And then analysis, reporting, and metrics. You know, this first bullet here, it's OLAP, online analytical processing. You also see OLTP, online transaction processing. But you know, those my warehouse diagram I had clear to the left side the operational data and the different sources of that. Those, of course, are transactional systems. Someone goes into the Orbit tool and creates an IV&V issue. That's a record being created within a transactional database. That's just a snapshot of work in time there. You know, you get into these analytical processing views, the multi-dimensional data. You know, I talked about the time dimension and then being able to aggregate those different facts so you can do interesting analysis. I mentioned this a minute ago, I guess, SQL Server reporting services. You know, that does also support kind of an ad hoc reporting view of the world. I had that on another slide earlier, but you can have that through the web interface and also email subscriptions to get results from reports or queries that are being run. And then, of course, metrics is our metrics team here and others. You know, if you start to stand up these kinds of views of data, those are some of the more interesting things you're going to want to look into and get insight from. I mean, one example there would be, and I know the TQ&E folks have said these kinds of things, IV&V method utilization over time by project. So, you know, we've got some method defined for requirements analysis that, you know, without actually, we could have that there for 10 years and maybe it's kind of fits and starts in who uses it or how effectively they use it. These are the sorts of things you could start to look at. You know, how much is that method being used and how's it being used over time by our projects? And ask the question, is that even a useful method anymore, or should it be updated? So, there's just all kinds of interesting things you can look at there. It's kind of the last bullet's really a reiteration of what I said a little while ago, I guess. You can, of course, you don't have to live in all of these maybe more robust views of the data. You can go out to lightweight options like Excel for some very specific or targeted analysis that you have. And related IV&V efforts, the IV&V office, the IBVO data management, there's been some folks within the program, myself included, who have been sitting down together and talking about these kinds of issues, and there have been some initiatives identified for FY14 to try to advance the ball some on that. The analysis management framework, we mentioned that a couple times, was talked about some this week, and of course, that this is part of that data. Most certainly, I think it's a subset of that broadest picture of data, but it certainly is a key part of it with analysis execution and the data being captured from that. We are working on SWOT to develop some dashboards for the tools we've developed, like the Risk Manager, and we have a Compass tool for our catalog of methods and process assets that we're working on, that we want to be able to have those dashboards pull data from various sources and have web services be part of this picture, which is what I mentioned earlier. And then, of course, the Atlassian, these are COTS vendor tools, but most things nowadays are trying to permit you hooks into, they call them gadgets, but really they're just plugins or really web service, being able to hook things in and have things presented with different views of the data from different locations. So I guess that's pretty much all I had. Any questions?
Are there any questions on the phone?
Once again, to ask a question, you may press *1.
Okay.
It seems to me that the AMS is a big thing. We've had several presentations on it. And every time I got a different presentation, I got a clearer understanding of what it means, but I still don't fully understand it because our project hasn't been exposed to it. Now, I'm wondering, since it seems to be a very important thing coming down the pipe, is this something you want to follow SWOT in the future? And then
Yeah, I mean, what I can say to that, and I know there's been discussions in the room with Steve Husty, who's the TQ&E lead and was the CD lead, with myself and Don Kranz in the same room together. But what I can say to that is I think that is a recognized path forward at some point, that if we have AMF is the domain model or the abstracted view of things. I think Don's reinforced that this week. An implementation of AMF that is sort of a common implementation that the program wants to support or use on projects. I think there is an understanding that at some point SWOT would be, as we are with other tools, the maintainers or the supporters of such a thing. That's what I believe there's some consensus on. So.
could the AWP be the implementation?
It is currently. I mean, I don't know end state, but yes, I mean, that what was shown and talked about, the analyst workbench, that is an implementation of it. And I will say, and I've told Don and others this, the Eclipse platform for that type of tool, which is a traceability-based tool and has some other things, I do think that does have some inherent advantages to it, the Eclipse platform. So, but yes, I mean, I've probably said more than I need to, but in short, though, if there's going to be a push forward on something like that is a supported tool for projects, there's agreement SWOT will have their hands on that in some fashion. So.
Was there a question on the phone?
Yes, you may go ahead with your question.
Hi, Chris. It's Mary. How are you?
Hi, good.
Hello?
I'm sorry, I didn't speak loudly enough. Hi.
Yeah, I can hear you. First off, I'd just like to say I love your slides. I like the little cards, and I know last year you did the thing with the coffee where the guy was sitting there with all the coffee cups. So I like the visual presentation. One of the challenges we have over here is we have a lot of data and we don't get the utilization out of it. So the idea of having the dashboard and the access to the interfaces and the different tools, I think is like an awesome idea. And the idea for the vocabulary too, I had actually done that with one of my groups where we don't have the shared vocabulary, so the documents weren't being shared across. But once we got a table together with that information, it made a big difference. So.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are no other questions on the phone.
Thanks, Marla. If there's any other questions, we'll go ahead